Welcome to another Forms View tutorial, and in today's tutorial we're going to do a digital fabrication project. So in this tutorial you will experience how to conceptualize non-developable surfaces, and you will also be able to create and fabricate organic surfaces, as well as create a system across contours that will friction fit the pieces together and represent this type of surface. So towards the end I will also show you how to prepare your files to be used for a laser cutting machine or a CNC router. So the surface you see here on the screen is called a non-developable surface. It's a type of surface that cannot be bent or folded using a piece of paper. So that's kind of the idea behind a non-developable surface. So in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to make this exact object. Not exactly this exact object, but a process in which you're going to be using to create a similar object. So first we start off with the surface, which I'm going to create here. So now this is a surface here that's just a flat 2D plane. I'm going to convert this surface into a NURB surface using the nConvert tool. And now that we have a NURB surface, I'm going to reconstruct the surface using the NURBS reconstruction tool along the NURB surfaces toolset. So I click on the surface. I can here give it a level of curvature, and down here give it a certain level of control points. So the next thing I'm going to use the move tool to start moving these points up and down. So as long as I have perpendicular to reference plane, I can just click and pull, and it will only move the points up and down the Z direction. If I want to move multiple points, I can hold the shift key and move multiple objects or points in that way. So I'm going to be using a surface here that I predefined earlier. Looks very similar to the one you saw at the beginning of this tutorial. So the first thing I do, I'm going to create 3 layers, one called thickened surface, one called notch A, and one called notch B. So I'm going to make the thickened surface layer active, and then I'm going to go over here to the thicken tool, which can be found under the Derive to toolbar. I'm going to use the thicken tool. I want to thicken the object from the center outwards using a 2-inch increment, and then I'm going to click on the surface. So now it will give us our object that will be 2 inches all the way around, a uniform thickness of 2. So next I'm going to make notch A active on the layers toolbar, and then I'm going to turn off the thickened surface. I'm going to go back through unghost the original surface, and now I'm going to use the thicken tool again, but only thicken it from the inside, and I'm also going to give it increment of half of our thickened surface. Not exactly half, but just a little bit more than half, so I'm going to give it 1 1/4. And then I'm going to click on my object, and it will thicken it only from the inside out. So you see that's half the distance of our original thickened surface. I'm going to make this a different color just so it's easier to tell the difference apart. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go into the notch B layer, make that active, turn off our notch A. Then I'm going to go through unghost our original surface, and then I'm going to thicken it again, but this time I'm going to thicken it from the outside. So I'm going to click on the out area, and then I'm going to give it the same amount as I thickened it from the inside. So I'm going to click on my object, and now it's only going to give it a thickness of 1 1/4 inches from the outside half. So I'm going to give that a certain color to distinguish it from the rest, as you can see there. So the next thing I do is I'm going to turn on my thickened surface layer, turn off my notch B, and now we have to trim off all the non-perpendicular edges that the thicken tool made for us. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a rectangle along the bottom to use as our trimming object. So I'm going to select the midpoint of one of the corners and the midpoint of the opposite corner. As you see there. So the next thing I do, I'm going to use the offset outline tool. I'm going to offset this object inwards 1 inch. The reason for offsetting it 1 inch is because since we thicken this surface 2 inches, the maximum deviation can only be 1 inch in or 1 inch out. So 1 inch in will make sure that I cut off any non-perpendicular edges for this object. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to extrude the inner rectangle upwards so that it crosses and goes through our object. And I can delete the bottom rectangle. And another important thing is to move that rectangle downwards so that you make sure that it cuts through the whole piece and doesn't leave any pieces hanging off. So I'm going to move this object now. So now we know it was going through the pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using this cube multiple times within the next couple steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click this cube, I'm going to copy this cube, and now I'm going to use the intersect tool to find the intersection between our object and the cube. So I'm going to be clicking the cube and our object, and what's left behind should only be the in-between pieces. So you see here, this piece is now a one solid piece. If I click on the information tab over in the tool options area, you see that's all solid. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on notch A and do the same process. I'm going to turn off my thickened surface layer, and then since we have that box copied, we can just right click and paste, and it will paste in place. As long as you have the paste on active layer option checked in your layers tool palette, anything that you paste will be pasted on the active layer. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to use the intersect tool again, and click on the box, click on our object, and then again it will only give us the object that's in between. So we're going to do the same thing one more time to our notch B layer, turn off our notch A, right click, paste our box, and do the same process. Intersect the box and the object. And now we only have the objects that intersect in between. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go back to our thickened surface object. And now I'm going to contour this object to create our contours. So I'm going to be using the contour tool. And I'm going to change the reference plane so that I know my contours are going in the right certain direction that I want. So I'm going to change the reference plane to a different set of contours, so I get a different set of contours. I'm going to select 20 contours in this direction. You can also set a measurement that you want if you want a certain measurement along each piece, or if you do use a number of increments, it will take the whole length and divide it by 20 and give you 20 pieces. So that's what I want. I'm going to click on my object, and it gives us a set of contours. So this is our contour 1. So I'm going to cut this from this layer and paste it into my contour 1 layer. I created a new layer called contour 1. I'm going to paste this into my new layer, and then I'm going to hide it. I'm going to go back to my thickened surface layer. So I'm going to go back and unghost my object, and then I'm going to create my second set of contours that sit perpendicular to the contour 1. So I'm going to change my reference plane so it's perpendicular to the first set of contours. So I'm going to use the contour tool again, but this time I want an increment of 24 because the object is longer this way. So I'm going to use increment in 24 and use the contour tool. I'm going to click on my object, and it creates our contours running perpendicular to our contour 1. So you see there. So I'm going to cut all these contours from this layer and place them in another layer called contour 2. And if you turn on contour 1 and contour 2, you can see that our object there is very similar to the surface we had earlier. So if I unghost our surface there, you can see it's very close to the original object. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create the notches for each contour. So as you can see here, this is what I mean by notches. So each contour has its own set of notches. So contour 1, which is in our blue, has notches only on the upper half and solid on the bottom half, and our contour 2 has a solid upper half and notches on the bottom half. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to use our notch geometry to create our notches. So I'm going to turn on contour 1 along with our notch A, and you see that contour 1 runs in this direction, but we want our notches to run perpendicular to contour 1. So we're going to create the contours in the perpendicular direction. Make sure your reference plane is in the correct area, which ours is. It's perpendicular to our contour 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the contour tool, and I'm going to use the increment of 24 because we contoured our original surface structure 24 the long way. So I'm going to use 24, and I'm going to click on my object, and now it gives us our contours. So these would be our notches for our contour pieces. So the next thing I do, I don't need the first or the last of our notch contours, because if we create a notch at the very ends, there's nothing to put next to it. There's nothing for it to connect to. So we delete the first and the last, and what we're going to do next is we're going to thicken our notch contours. So I'm going to select all my notches, or all my notch contours, and I'm going to use the thicken tool again, and then this time I'm going to give it a center justification and also set an increment of a ½ inch. So I was going to use a ½ inch plywood to make this object out of, so I set ½ inch. So the thickness should be whatever material you're going to use. You could use a ½ inch, or if you use something smaller like a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch, you set the thickness to that increment, and you thicken all the objects to that same thickness. So what we're going to do now is we're going to split our contour 1 using our notch A contours that now have thicknesses to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all my blue contours, which is my contour 1. I'm going to deselect the first and the last, because we don't need to cut the notches into the first or the last, because those would be our end pieces. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a surface split under the modify toolbar. I'm going to do a one-way split, and then using the shift key, I can select multiple objects, but I'm only going to do the first 3 just to speed up this process. But essentially you would click all the notch A contours, and you can execute the command all at once. So I click here on the screen, and it executes the command, and what the result will be, it will trim off all the pieces that intersected the contour 1. So you see here, all these are all individual pieces now. I can just window across all the pieces and delete all the pieces I don't need. So as you see there, those are all our notches that we need for our contour 1. I have a specific layer here where I already did the process, as you see there. So we have 1/2 of our pieces that we need. So we need to create the second half of our pieces, which will be our contour 2. As you see there. So we have our contour 1 set, and we need to create the pieces for our contour 2. I'm going to create the contours using notch B. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the contour tool again. And since I know this is the short direction, I'm going to be using 20, because that's what I specified earlier for the shorter direction of our object. And I'm going to need to change the reference plane so that the contours will be created perpendicular to contour 2. So I'm going to use the contour tool, I'm going to contour my object. There we go. Just color code it just so you can tell the difference. So our notch B, which is now the green tinted layer. So I'll go back and I need to delete the first and the last, similar to the process we used earlier for notch A. Delete the very first and the last piece because we no longer need it. And then we're going to select all our notch B pieces. And then I'm going to thicken them the same amount that I used earlier. So I'm going to use a 1/2 inch. So now all the pieces will be a 1/2 inch increment, as you can see there. So the next step is to split our contour 1 using our notch B. So I will use the split tool again under the modify toolbar. But first I'm going to select all of my contour 2. And then use the split tool. And then I'm going to select the contours of notch B. So I'm only going to show you the first 3 just to speed up the process. But if you group all the objects together, you can just simply click one object and it will all select all the pieces for notch B. So as you can see there, you can go back in and now you can just window all the extra pieces you don't need. Hit delete. So now you have all your pieces. So I've already made a finalized piece here, as you can see there. And now if I turn on final contour 1 and 2, you can see that the pieces all have the contours where they need to be, and the notches are along every contour. So if I was to create this piece here, so if I made this 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch, which what it would be in real life. So the way the system works is these objects can move up and down. As you can see there, the pieces just slide into each other. So what I'm going to show you next is how to lay out these pieces to use if you're using a laser cutting machine or a CNC machine. So the next thing I do is I'm going to turn off one of the layers and just have one layer active. I'm going to go into an elevation view and I'm going to move these pieces so they no longer overlap each other. Like so. So I already done this in the separate layer just to speed up the process. So I have the pieces here, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and make all the pieces flat on a certain plane, because when pulling the pieces apart it doesn't put them on a flat plane, so they're still floating around in 3-dimensional space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all my objects here on the screen, and over here in the tool options area under the info tab, you can specify a specific X, Y, or Z increment. So here I'm going to click on the X input, put 0 in as my X input, and there you see it takes all the objects and put them on the 0 plane of that axis. So I have my other layers. So my second set of contours, which I do the same process, I move them all apart from each other and then project them onto a flat plane using the tool options window. So here I go into an elevation view again. So all these objects are completely flat. What we can do next, if you're laser cutting, you can select all the objects. There's an uncover tool, which can be found here. If you click on the screen, after selecting all your objects, these are now all wireframe objects. So these are just simply lines. As you can see here, they're all joined together and all smooth lines. But if you also want a different type of curve, FormZ also has a curved arcs tool that can be found under the modify NURBS curve. And also, if you want faceted line work, we have a convert tool that will take all the smooth lines and convert it to faceted data. So this information here could be used for laser cutting if you're going to go down that route. It can also be used for CNC cutting too. because the machine can do either 2D or 3D depending on which type of machine that you have. So if you follow these steps here, you should be able to get a result very similar to the one I had at the beginning of this tutorial, as you can see there. So all these pieces here are all friction fitted together because our material thickness and our tolerance were almost very exact to what we had here in the 3D model. So I gave it all a ½ inch increment. So the ½ inch pieces here fit very well together. It's all friction fitted, very simple assembly, no glue, no nails needed. So that concludes this digital fabrication tutorial. And if you're asking yourself why would you use this process, you would use this process to conceptualize non-developable surfaces. And as I said earlier, these are the type of surfaces that can't be bent or folded out of a physical object. So using a very quick and simple method to deconstruct a 3D model to physically build it, and it's a very cost-efficient process because using the very minimal amount of material to represent an idea in a surface. So you also get a very high level of accuracy by using this process to lay out the pieces to be able to use a laser cutting machine or a CNC router. So try this process for yourself to see what creative structures you can come up with and be able to fabricate for yourself.